Hi, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com. Today we're going to make no-knead rye bread, and this is what it looks like. As you can see, it has a beautiful golden brown crust, nice and crisp when it's freshly baked with a little bit of a chew, soft and tender crumb, good rye flavor, and if you're like me, you like to add some caraway seeds to your rye bread. Caraway seeds have a distinct flavor, so if you are a person that doesn't like it, you can just leave it out. So, to make a no-knead bread, really simple, no kneading, as the name implies, and you just mix the ingredients together. So you will need a large bowl. Of course, we need rye flour, 3/4 of a cup, 100 grams of rye flour. I'm using a dark. If you prefer, you could use a light rye as well. And rye flour that doesn't have a good gluten-forming properties, so typically when you make a rye bread, you also add some wheat flour. So I am adding 1.5 cups, 200 grams of unbleached all-purpose flour, as well as 1.5 cups, 200 grams of unbleached bread flour. And that way, we're going to get a nice rise to our rye bread. Not as much as if you make like just a no-knead white bread. You get quite a bit of rise with big holes. With a rye bread, you don't get quite the rise, and the crumb is a little more dense. Really good though. Now, for the yeast, you will need 3/4 of a teaspoon, 3 grams of, you can either use an SAF red instant yeast, or if you prefer, you could just use 3/4 of a teaspoon of active dry yeast, either one. And then I'm adding 1/2 teaspoon, 1 gram of dry malt diastatic powder. That helps with the color of our crust. You could, if you don't want to have this, you don't want to buy it, you could just use 1/2 teaspoon of just granulated white sugar. And then 2 teaspoons, 10 grams of, I'm using a fine kosher salt. And then, like I said, entirely optional, I'm using 1 tablespoon, about 8 grams of caraway seeds. It's not a lot of caraway. I don't like a lot, but I do like the flavor of a caraway seed. I don't even know how to describe it. It's kind of an earthy flavor, and it has a really nice smell, but you'll know as soon as you smell it whether you want to have it in your bread, but try it. So I'm just mixing everything by hand. You could use like a wooden spoon, wire whisk. You could even use just a plastic scraper, but you know, hand works really well. And just put like a little well in the center, and I'm adding 1.5 cups, which is 360 milliliters, 360 grams, just room temperature. I'm just water. I like to use filtered water, but other than that, it's just water. And like I said, you could use your wooden spoon, or I'm just using my hand. All we're doing is moistening all the dry ingredients. That's it, and then we stop. That's what's so great about making a no-knead bread. No mixer, no kneading. That looks good. You can see 20, 30 seconds, that's all you need. And we are done. The thing you do have to have is time when you make a no-knead bread, because now we're going to cover this with plastic wrap, and we're going to let it, once I get it all off my hands, and we're going to cover it with a piece of plastic wrap. And I'm just going to leave it right on the counter, room temperature. I'm going to say somewhere between 12 and 18 hours. Now that's quite a bit of time difference there, because it depends on the temperature of your room temperature of your kitchen. If it's in the summer and pretty warm, then it might only take 12 hours. If it's in the winter and it's a little cold, it might take 18, maybe even longer. For reference, I've been making this a lot lately. my room temperature is kind of somewhere around the 74 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 Celsius. And I find this, there's a little variance there in temperature, but about 14 to 15 hours. So you can kind of just use that. Really, the first time you make it, you want to check it at 12, maybe even a little before, 12 hours to see. But really, because what you are looking for is your dough will double in size, and the top surface is going to have bubbles on it. So that's what you're looking at. So time is one gauge, but really you want to look at your dough and you go by that mainly. But so time is one thing. So that's what I'm going to do. What I like to do, I typically make my bread at around supper time, then let it ferment overnight, and then I can form it and bake it off in the morning. So that's a good way to do it. So we will see you back here tomorrow morning. So I let the dough sit overnight, and as you can see, it's doubled in size, and there's air bubbles or holes over the top surface. So now we are ready to form it into a round. So I'm just going to put a little flour on my surface. And then I'm going to flip it out so the top is on the bottom. Clean my bowl. I'll put this back here. And it is sticky, so I'm just going to put a little flour on the top. And then just pat it into a rectangle, like so. And then I'm going to fold it into the center, like you're folding a letter. And then over the top. And then take the top, fold it into the center, and then top down to the bottom. And then I'm just sealing it a little. Tuck your sides in, and then just roll it into a round, just like that. Now I have a piece of parchment paper. This is actually a reusable parchment paper. You use regular parchment paper, or you could just use a smooth cotton cloth, kitchen cloth. Make sure it's a smooth surface like cotton or something. You don't want one with a nubby, like kind of a rough surface, because then the dough will stick to it and it's hard to get it off. But I am putting, you could put some flour down on your paper, or I'm using cornmeal, just so that it won't stick. And just use this. A little sticky. I'm just going to put just a little bit of flour, like so. And then you could cover this with just another kitchen cloth, or I'm just going to take the plastic wrap that I used before, and I'm just going to spray it with one of these non-stick sprays. You could actually lightly oil it as well. And I do that so that when I put it over top of the round of dough, it doesn't stick to it. And then we're going to let this sit, I would say, again, depending on the temperature of the room temperature of your kitchen, somewhere between an hour and a half to 2 hours. It's going to almost double in size. And when you take your finger and gently push into the dough, it will leave the indentation and it will just slowly come up. That's when you know it's ready. Now, I'm going to come back in a little bit because when you bake this bread, it's a little different than a normal bread. So I'm going to come back in a little bit and we'll talk about that. When we bake this bread, it's a little different than a regular bread. We're actually going to bake it in a pot, a covered pot, and the pot needs to be really hot, because what we're kind of doing is making a little oven within our oven, and it's when you put the bread in there, that really hot pot, and put the cover on and bake it, it's like all the moisture is held and the heat is held inside that pot, and that is what gives us that beautiful golden brown crisp crust, and the bread is really nice and soft and moist inside. So what kind of pot? You can use, the two types that I use are either the cast iron Dutch oven like this. Now this one has the enamel coating on the outside. You can just buy like a regular cast iron. They're not that expensive. Or the other choice is this ceramic bread cloche like this. I've used both. This one's my favorite. But you know, I don't find a lot of difference between both of these, so either one. If you bake a lot of bread, you might want to invest in this. If you don't bake bread that often, probably just use just a cast iron Dutch oven. Now, like I said, you want to get this really hot before we put our bread in there. So as you're preheating your oven, put your pot inside, and that way it'll get really hot. I'm using an electric oven. Have your rack in the lower third of the oven. And I find you want to preheat your electric oven, minimum amount is say 30 minutes. I actually like to have my pot in there and preheat my oven for 45 minutes. That way it gets really hot and I get that wonderful crisp crust. So you need to preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 232 degrees Celsius. And put your pot inside, and then when we come back, we will bake off our bread. So now we are ready to bake our bread. As you can see, nice and puffy. If I take my finger, I'll just get a little cornmeal on there and push it in. The indentation will stay, and then with time it would come back up. So I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of cornmeal or flour on the top of the bread because we're going to invert it so the top will become the bottom of our pot. So just so it doesn't stick. And very carefully, because that pot is really hot, we're going to take it out of the oven and flip our bread into it. Okay, so take the lid off. Be very careful, it is hot. I'm just going to flip this as best as you can into that. And if it isn't perfect, just shake to get it into the center. Put the lid back on, and then we're going to bake this for 30 minutes with the lid on. Then we're going to take the lid off and bake for another 10 to 15 or until it's a beautiful golden brown. So it's been 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do very carefully is take the lid off, and then we're going to continue to cook the bread for about 10 to 15 minutes or until it's a deep golden brown. Okay, so our rye bread is done. Doesn't that look gorgeous golden brown? You tap it, sounds hollow. I'm just gonna carefully. Now you could, especially when you're the first time you're making this, if you have a probe thermometer, you could stick it into the center and it should read, I like it at about 205 Fahrenheit, which is about 96 Celsius. But a lot of time with bread, you can just go by the color. And this is beautiful golden brown. Now, you don't want to cut into your bread. I know everybody likes warm bread from the oven, but it takes time for it to cool down. And because if you cut it too early, the center or the bread will be a little gummy. And so that's why you want to let it cool down completely. I would say at least an hour. That's what I'm going to do, and when we come back, we will try a slice. So I let the bread cool down, so let's cut a slice using a serrated knife. Oh, it sounds wonderful. So there we have it. Now, if you compare the texture of the rye bread to, say, a white bread. You will notice it's a lot more dense. The holes are smaller, and that's because of the rye flour. It smells wonderful. I can smell those caraway seeds. Oh, just take a little bit. A very flavorful bread. The crust is nice and chewy, soft and tender inside. And, you know, butter, little cheese, sandwiches, great toast. It'll last like quite a while because it's quite a moist bread. So I'd say, 2-3 days. You can also freeze it. So you have to try this one. And until next time, I'm Stephanie Jaworski of joybaking.com.